The scout froze mid-step. His hand shot up palm flat. Behind him, 5 men stopped breathing. 30 meters ahead through the green wall, something moved that wasn't wind and wasn't animal. The sergeant checked his watch. 0847 hours. 3 days into enemy territory. They'd been walking since before dawn through jungle so dense they measured progress in yards per hour, not miles per day. It was April 1944. The 6-man patrol belonged to the Alamo Scouts, Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's answer to a problem that was costing American lives. Before every amphibious landing in the Southwest Pacific, intelligence officers guessed. They guessed how many Japanese held the beach. They guessed where defenses sat. They guessed wrong. At Kiska Island in the Aleutians, 35,000 Allied troops had stormed ashore to capture an island the Japanese had already abandoned. Kruger watched the invasion fleet steam away empty-handed and decided the 6th Army needed eyes that worked. The scout's hand moved. 3 fingers pointed left. 2 pointed right. The patrol melted off the trail into undergrowth so thick a man 3 feet away became invisible. Through gaps in the foliage they watched. A column of Japanese infantry filed past. Rifles slung. Talking. 15 men. 20. 35. The scouts counted. Noted unit markings. Memorized faces. The last Japanese soldier disappeared. The patrol waited. Counted to 300. They had 72 hours to map every Japanese position on a beach where 8,000 American troops would land. The landing depended on what 6 men with cameras and notebooks could discover. Getting the intelligence mattered. Getting it back alive mattered more. New Guinea measured 1,600 miles from end to end. Mountains cut the island in half, running west to east. Between the mountains and the coasts lay some of the most hostile terrain soldiers had ever fought across. Rainfall hit 300 inches per year on the northern side where most combat happened. The jungle wasn't one environment. It was layers. Triple canopy forest blocked sunlight. Secondary growth choked the ground level. Vines connected everything. Visibility dropped to 20 meters. Sometimes 5. Disease thrived. Malaria was everywhere. Dengue fever. Dysentery. Scrub typhus. During the New Guinea campaign, both sides lost more men to sickness than to bullets. Australian troops learned this first. When Japanese forces landed at La and Salamaua on March 8, 1942, small units of the New Guinea Volunteer Rifles melted into the mountains. They'd been planters, miners, patrol officers, men who knew the territory. They watched the Japanese build up strength and reported what they saw. They couldn't stop the invasion. They could make the Japanese pay for every mile. The Australians formed independent companies. Small units trained for exactly this kind of war. The 2/3 Independent Company arrived in New Guinea in February 1943 under Major George Worf. Their mission was reconnaissance and harassment. Deep patrols into Japanese-held territory. Ambushes. Intelligence gathering. They operated from Wau through terrains so rugged that supply lines couldn't reach forward positions. Everything came by airdrop or native carrier. In May 1943, the 2/3 attacked Bobdubi Ridge. The ridge controlled the track to Salamaua where Japanese forces concentrated. 2 reinforced platoons hit Japanese positions on May 3rd and 4th. They took part of the ridge. For 2 weeks, Australian commandos held the position running patrols that reached deep into enemy territory. The Japanese counterattacked on May 14th with artillery and mortars. The Australians withdrew, but the damage was done. Japanese commanders had to divert troops to protect their supply lines. The 2/3 RD's patrol tactics evolved through trial and blood. Early patrols moved in column. The lead scout walked point. Second scout followed. The column stretched 20 meters with men spaced for mutual support but far enough apart that one ambush couldn't kill everyone. They learned fast that pre-existing tracks were death traps. The Japanese pre-arranged their artillery on every trail junction. They set up interlocking machine gun positions covering creek crossings. They left observers to watch approaches. The Australians adapted. Instead of column formation, patrols moved with 3 or 4 men on line. Extended front. 4 pairs of eyes instead of 1. When contact came, more weapons could return fire immediately. The technique saved lives but required extraordinary noise discipline. In jungles so dense that visibility measured in meters, sound carried. The crack of a twig, metal touching metal, a cough. Any of it could bring Japanese patrols or worse, artillery. Australian patrols out of the 24th Battalion on Bougainville in 1945 spent 3 to 4 days in the field. Up to 70% of rifle companies were on patrol at any given time. They covered long distances through terrain that didn't exist on maps. Aerial photography couldn't penetrate jungle canopy. The only way to know what sat in the next valley was walk there and look. One report from the 24th noted that leading scout was a suicide job. The forward scout's role was nerve-wracking. The man walking point knew he'd make contact first. His reaction time determined whether the patrol fought or died. The Australians rotated the position. Nobody walked point all day. The strain broke even experienced soldiers. Ambushes became the primary offensive tactic. Australian doctrine said ambushes should occur where enemy couldn't maneuver. Creek crossings, trail junctions, anywhere terrain channeled movement. The ambush party positioned themselves in an L shape when possible. The killing zone sat in the angle. Automatic weapons at both ends. Riflemen in the middle. When Japanese entered the kill zone, the ambush opened fire all at once. Maximum violence. Then immediate withdrawal on pre-planned routes before enemy reinforcements arrived. Between April 13th and July 7th, 1945, the 24th Battalion conducted 412 specially ordered patrols. Each patrol averaged just over 5 kilometers. Total distance covered was 2,204 kilometers. The battalion suffered 183 battle casualties, including 38 deaths. That represented 26.9% of unit strength. In the same period, they counted 317 Japanese killed and captured 6 prisoners. The statistics showed what jungle patrol warfare cost. High casualties, slow progress, grinding attrition. The Americans learned similar lessons through different methods. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger took command of 6th Army in early 1943. He understood that amphibious landings required accurate intelligence. The usual sources couldn't provide it. Air reconnaissance photographed the general picture but couldn't see through triple canopy jungle. Navy submarines could observe coastlines but not inland. Local sources, when they existed, often proved unreliable. On November 28, 1943, Kruger issued orders establishing the Alamo Scouts training center on Ferguson Island, New Guinea. He wanted small teams of highly trained volunteers who could infiltrate behind enemy lines, gather intelligence, and extract without being detected. The unit was designated the U.S. 6th Army Special Reconnaissance Unit, but everyone called them Alamo Scouts. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Bradshaw, a lawyer from Mississippi, became the first director. The training center opened with its first class beginning December 27, 1943. The 6-week course was brutal. Volunteers came from 6th Army combat units. They'd already proven themselves in action. The training center refined them into something else. The course emphasized 8 major skill areas: rubber boat handling for amphibious infiltration, intelligence gathering and report writing, scouting and patrolling, jungle navigation without compasses when magnetic declination made compasses unreliable, communications including Morse code and radio operation, weapons proficiency with every weapon system the enemy used and several the scouts carried, physical conditioning that went beyond regular infantry standards. Training ran from 0800 to 2200 hours. 4 weeks of classroom work combined with practical exercises. Then 2 weeks of field problems that simulated actual missions. Live fire training was so realistic some candidates took minor gunshot wounds. The course taught survival skills, including which beetles were edible and which weren't. malaria discipline, water purification, first aid, navigation by terrain association when maps proved inaccurate or didn't exist. Class size ranged from 45 to 100 volunteers. Attrition ran 40% in the first 2 weeks. Some men couldn't handle the physical demands. Others failed the mental requirements. The instructors watched everything. How candidates reacted under stress. Whether they could think when exhausted. If they'd follow orders or freeze when ambushed during night exercises. The Alamo Scouts used peer evaluation. At the end of the course, surviving candidates voted on who they respected most, who they trust in combat. The instructors combined these peer rankings with their own assessments. Only the top performers were retained as Alamo Scouts. The rest returned to their units as highly trained scouts, but not scouts with a capital S. Of approximately 250 enlisted men and 75 officers who graduated from 9 training classes between December 1943 and September 1945, only 117 enlisted men and 21 officers were retained as Alamo Scouts. The selectivity ensured quality. Every scout who made it through represented the elite of an already elite selection. Scout teams consisted of 6 or 7 men. 1 officer, usually a lieutenant, as team leader. 5 or 6 enlisted men with specialized skills. Radio operator, medic, weapons specialist. The composition varied, but the principle didn't. Small team, high skill, maximum flexibility. Their first operational mission came in February 1944. Lieutenant John McGowan led a team to Los Negros Island in the Admiralty Islands. The invasion was originally planned for April. Allied success at other landings moved the timetable forward. The new plan called for a reconnaissance in force. If Japanese presence proved weak, the reconnaissance would become an invasion. The scouts needed to assess enemy strength 48 hours before the main force arrived. On February 26 at 0330 hours, the team boarded a PBY Catalina. They wore camouflage jungle suits and ponchos. Each man carried a carbine, grenades, and 2 days of care rations. 1 scout carried an SCR-300 radio for communication with the aircraft. Weather prevented the first landing attempt. The PBY returned at 0830. The team would try again the next day. When they finally inserted, the scouts moved inland from the beach. Counted enemy positions. Mapped defensive works. Photographed installations. They radioed findings every few hours. Japanese presence was significant but not overwhelming. The reconnaissance in force went ahead. American troops landed and secured the island. The operation succeeded because 6 men spent 48 hours behind enemy lines and got accurate intelligence back. The mission established the pattern. Before each major 6th Army amphibious landing, scout teams went in first. At Hollandia in April 1944, scouts landed with regular forces and scouted the flanks. They probed ahead toward the airfields. At 8 April, they landed on nearby islands looking for Japanese outposts. At Wakdisami, they performed reconnaissance before and after landings, probing the flanks of landing zones. At Bayak, they went in with main landings and scouted for suitable beaches to bring landing craft ashore. The teams operated on tight schedules. Missions in New Guinea typically lasted 1 to 3 days. Insert by PT boat, submarine, or amphibious aircraft. Move to the objective. Gather intelligence. Extract. The short duration kept teams light. Minimum equipment. Minimum rations. Maximum mobility. They couldn't resupply in the field. Everything they needed had to fit on their backs. Scouts were taught to avoid combat when possible. Their mission was intelligence, not fighting. If discovered, they withdrew rather than engaged. But when engagement couldn't be avoided, they fought with everything they had. Every scout selected his own combat weapon. Most chose the M1 carbine for its light weight and reliability. Some carried Thompson submachine guns. Others preferred the M1 Garand rifle. The choice reflected individual preference and anticipated mission requirements. The training emphasized working with native populations. Scouts practiced basic Pidgin English for New Guinea operations. Those training for Philippine missions learned rudimentary Tagalog. The locals could provide intelligence, guide patrols, carry supplies, warn of Japanese movements. Treating natives with respect and dignity wasn't just morality. It was tactical necessity. At Noem 4 Island in June 1944, Scouts went in 11 days before the main landing. They were spotted by Japanese defenders. The discovery compromised tactical surprise. The Japanese responded by moving their main force into the landing area where the massive pre-invasion bombardment destroyed them. The Scouts hadn't achieved perfect reconnaissance, but the intelligence about Japanese movements proved valuable anyway. On June 23, 1944, Scout teams executed a rescue operation at Aransbury in the Manokwari area. Allied civilians and Javanese internees were being held by the Japanese. The Scouts infiltrated the area, located the prisoners, and planned the extraction. The rescue succeeded. 66 Allied prisoners were liberated. The operation demonstrated that Scout capabilities extended beyond pure reconnaissance into direct action when required. The character of Scout missions changed in the Philippines. In New Guinea, operations lasted days. In the Philippines, some missions extended to weeks or months. The civilian population was friendly instead of neutral or hostile. Large numbers of Filipino guerrilla forces operated in Japanese-held territory. The Scouts worked closely with guerrillas, coordinating airdrops of arms and supplies, using diplomatic skills to encourage rival guerrilla bands to cooperate. The Scouts' most famous mission came in January 1945 at Cabanatuan. Over 500 American POWs were held in a camp 25 miles behind Japanese lines. The prisoners had survived the Bataan Death March. They'd endured years of captivity. Intelligence suggested the Japanese might execute them rather than allow liberation. 2 scout teams, Nellist and Rounceville, received the mission: provide reconnaissance and tactical support for the 6th Ranger Battalion assault. The Scouts infiltrated the area days before the raid. They gathered intelligence on Japanese movements. They confirmed reports from Filipino guerrilla leader Juan Pajota that Japanese activity around the camp was tremendous. Lieutenant Bill Nellist needed better information on the camp's internal layout. The surrounding fields were too flat. Any approach would be spotted. He identified an abandoned shack that offered a vantage point. Nellist and Scout Rufo Vaquiller, a Filipino-American, dressed as Filipino villagers. Farmer clothes. They walked to the shack in daylight. The plan worked. From inside the shack, they could see directly into the compound. For 2 hours, they made detailed notes. Major features of the camp. Best routes for the Rangers. Then 3 more scouts arrived. They'd crawled on their bellies approaching from the rear. Nellist gave them his report and ordered them to get it to Ranger Commander Henry Mucci immediately. The information proved critical. The Rangers completed their plan. On the evening of January 30th, 1945, the raid began. The Scouts helped evacuate prisoners after the camp was secured. They stayed behind helping with casualties and watching for Japanese retaliation. By February 2nd, they were back at base camp. According to Scout Gilbert Cox's diary, they were enjoying life and waiting for the next job. The raid freed 516 Allied prisoners. 2 scout teams, Nellist and Rounceville, received the Presidential Unit Citation for their role. The recognition was rare. The mission's success depended on intelligence the Scouts provided through reconnaissance that required them to operate for days in an area saturated with Japanese forces. By July 1945, the Alamo Scouts were training for Operation Olympic, the invasion of Japan's home islands. They would conduct pre-invasion reconnaissance of Kyushu. The atomic bombs ended that requirement. Japan surrendered in August. On August 13th, 4 days after the second atomic bomb, scout teams in the field were ordered back to the training center. On September 2nd, the day Japan formally surrendered, training of the 9th and final scout class ceased 2 weeks early. The Alamo Scouts performed 106 to 110 known missions behind enemy lines in New Guinea and the Philippines. They never lost a single man killed or captured on operations. That record was unprecedented. Over 500 Japanese troops killed by scout actions. Over 60 Japanese prisoners captured for interrogation. Intelligence provided for every major 6th Army amphibious landing in the Southwest Pacific. The unit earned 118 combat decorations, 44 silver stars, 33 bronze stars, 4 soldiers' medals, numerous Purple Hearts for wounds received. For an ad hoc unit with no official table of organization, operating under a training center designation to avoid command friction, the results spoke clearly. The Scouts disbanded without ceremony at Kyoto, Japan, in November 1945. There was no formal deactivation. Men with enough points rotated home. Others returned to parent units. Some volunteered for occupation duty. The unit that had operated in absolute secrecy for 2 years simply ceased to exist. Australian independent companies followed a similar path. The 2/3 independent company that had fought from Wau to Salamaua was withdrawn in September 1943. They'd suffered 65 killed, 119 wounded, and 226 evacuated for medical reasons. Against that, they were credited with 969 Japanese killed. The exchange ratio reflected both skill and the brutal mathematics of jungle patrol warfare. In mid-1943, the Australian Army reorganized its divisions for jungle warfare. The independent companies were amalgamated into cavalry commando regiments. The 2/3 became 2 of 3 RD Cavalry Commando Squadron as part of 2 of 70H Cavalry Commando Regiment. The name would be simplified to just Commando Squadron in 1944. The change reflected lessons learned. Small unit tactics dominated jungle warfare. Commandos provided the skills regular infantry couldn't match. The squadrons fought in the final campaigns of 1945, Borneo, Bougainville, New Guinea. During these operations, they performed both commando roles and tasks that regular infantry could have handled. The war was ending. Conventional forces were available. The specialist skills that made commandos valuable in 1942 and 1943 were less critical when Allied superiority was overwhelming. What made long-range patrol tactics effective in New Guinea wasn't exotic equipment or special weapons. It was adaptation to environment, understanding that jungle warfare inverted normal military logic. Visibility measured in meters, not kilometers. Observation posts couldn't see terrain features. Artillery couldn't see targets. Infantry couldn't maintain visual contact with adjacent units. Air reconnaissance couldn't penetrate canopy. In that environment, small teams with specific skills became force multipliers. 6 men could gather intelligence worth thousands of troops. A well-executed ambush could tie down an entire battalion. Patrols that infiltrated enemy territory and returned with accurate information prevented costly mistakes. Both Australian and American forces learned that patrol tactics required mental toughness beyond physical endurance. Walking point where any step might trigger an ambush destroyed men's nerves. Operating for days in enemy territory with no resupply and no reinforcement if discovered demanded different psychology than conventional combat. The knowledge that extraction depended entirely on not being detected created constant stress. Navigation in jungle where compass readings varied wildly and maps proved inaccurate required terrain association skills that took months to develop. Soldiers learned to read minor changes in vegetation, recognize drainage patterns, identify ridge lines through dense foliage, use the sun when it was visible, which wasn't often. The techniques worked but required experience that couldn't be taught in classrooms. Patrol formations evolved through casualties. Column formation concentrated firepower but made the entire patrol vulnerable to ambush. Extended line provided broader front and more immediate firepower but required exceptional noise discipline and lateral communication without visual contact. The Australians and Americans arrived at similar solutions independently because jungle warfare demanded those solutions. Ambush tactics followed patterns dictated by terrain. The L-shaped ambush placed automatic weapons at the base and vertical of the L with the killing zone in the corner. Japanese forces moving into the zone took fire from two directions simultaneously. The ambush party could withdraw along pre-planned routes that avoided enemy reinforcement approaches. The tactic required detailed reconnaissance before execution and strict fire discipline during. One man firing early compromised everything. Disease control became as important as tactical proficiency. Units that didn't enforce malaria discipline lost more men to fever than to combat. Water purification procedures prevented dysentery that could disable entire patrols. Foot care prevented tropical ulcers that made walking impossible. Medical evacuation from deep jungle took days when it happened at all. Prevention was the only practical treatment. Supply by air drops sustained patrols when ground supply lines couldn't reach forward areas. Australian operations around WOW depended entirely on aerial resupply. American operations used submarine resupply for coastal infiltrations and airdrops for inland operations. The techniques worked but imposed weight limits on what patrols could carry. Everything became a calculation. More ammunition meant less food. More radio batteries meant fewer medical supplies. Native carriers made sustained operations possible. New Guineans carried supplies forward along tracks where vehicles couldn't operate. They served as scouts using knowledge of terrain no outsider could match. They warned of Japanese movements. On several occasions, Papuan infantry battalion soldiers saved Australian patrols from ambush through instinct for sensing enemy positions. The contribution of native forces was acknowledged at command level but rarely received the recognition it deserved. Japanese responses to Allied patrol tactics showed the effectiveness. Japanese forces increased security around supply routes. They established listening posts to detect Allied movement. They conducted their own patrol operations, though with less success. Japanese training emphasized defensive action. Defense and reconnaissance received less attention. When faced with Allied patrols that avoided contact and gathered intelligence instead of fighting, Japanese doctrine provided limited countermeasures. The tactical superiority Allied forces developed in jungle warfare didn't come from technology. It came from adaptation. Units that arrived in New Guinea in 1942 wearing desert warfare uniforms and carrying equipment designed for North Africa learned through casualties. Soldiers dyed uniforms with coffee to reduce visibility. They traded for Owen submachine guns and Thompson guns when M1 Garans proved too long for jungle fighting. They modified web gear to reduce noise. They developed tactics through trial and error when doctrine provided no answers. By 1945, Australian doctrine for jungle warfare was codified. Lieutenant General Stanley Savage's Tactical Doctrine for Jungle Warfare captured lessons from 3 years of combat. Patrolling was core to operations. Ambushes were the primary offensive tool. Perimeter defense replaced linear positions. Small unit initiative mattered more than battalion coordination. Fire and movement at section level determined outcomes more than brigade maneuvers. The lessons had cost thousands of lives to learn. The Australian 7th Division that fought on Kokoda Track in 1942 learned jungle warfare while retreating toward Port Moresby. The militia battalions that held against Japanese advance did so without proper equipment or training. By 1943, Australian divisions deploying to New Guinea received jungle warfare training at Canungra in Queensland. The Jungle Training Centre could process 6,000 replacements at a time. The difference between trained jungle fighters and conventional infantry showed immediately in casualty rates. For the Alamo Scouts and similar units, the training created capabilities conventional forces lacked. The 6-week course didn't make better soldiers in the conventional sense. It made different soldiers. Men who could operate independently for extended periods. Who could gather intelligence and transmit it accurately. Who understood that avoiding combat often required more courage than seeking it. who could move through hostile territory and leave no trace. The doctrine emphasized that scout teams were reconnaissance assets, not assault forces. When scouts engaged in combat, it represented mission failure, not success. The objective was information. Getting intelligence back to 6th Army mattered more than body counts. That mindset required discipline that contradicted combat soldier instincts. Training reinforced it through repetition and peer pressure. One aspect of patrol operations that both Australian and American forces discovered was the psychological toll. Soldiers who spent weeks on patrol deep in enemy territory returned with psychological strain that rest couldn't fully address. The constant vigilance required when every sound might be enemy movement created anxiety that persisted. The knowledge that rescue was impossible if discovered generated stress beyond normal combat operations. Units rotated personnel through patrol duty to prevent breakdown. The Australian practice of having 70% of rifle companies on patrol at any time meant the other 30% rested. Scout teams returned from missions and spent days or weeks in rear areas before the next operation. The rotation was necessary. Men broke under sustained patrol operations regardless of training or motivation. Long-range patrol tactics in New Guinea represented military adaptation to impossible terrain. When conventional warfare doctrine failed because jungle made conventional operations impractical, small units developed new methods. The methods worked because they matched environment. Patrol formations that maintained security while allowing movement. Ambush tactics that maximized surprise and minimized exposure. Intelligence gathering that substituted quality for quantity. The results validated the approach. Australian independent companies and commando squadrons conducted hundreds of patrol operations that shaped the New Guinea campaign. The 6th Independent Company's capture of Kayapit in September 1943 secured the Markham Valley and enabled the 7th Division's advance. The 2/3 RD's operations around Salamaua diverted Japanese forces from Laos, where the main Allied effort developed. The Alamo Scouts' perfect operational record stood as testament to training and tactics. 106 to 110 missions. 0 men lost. The intelligence they provided enabled 6th Army to execute amphibious landings across the Southwest Pacific with tactical surprise and accurate force estimates. The liberation of Allied POWs at Cabanatuan demonstrated capabilities beyond reconnaissance, though reconnaissance remained the primary mission. After the war, the lessons influenced Special Operations doctrine. The British SAS, Australian SASR, US Army Special Forces, and other units traced lineage or doctrine to World War II jungle patrol operations. The techniques developed in New Guinea provided templates. Small team operations. Extended autonomous operations. Intelligence gathering prioritized over direct action. Integration with native populations. The fundamentals remained relevant across subsequent conflicts. In 1988, the Alamo Scouts were awarded the Special Forces tab in recognition of their service during World War II. The Army included them in the lineage of modern Special Forces. The recognition came 43 years after the unit disbanded. For the men who served, the delayed acknowledgement mattered less than the mission record. They'd done what they were trained to do. Gathered intelligence. Saved lives. Came home. The Australian commando squadrons disbanded in 1946. Their members returned to civilian life or remained in service with conventional units. Some transferred to the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan. The specialist skills they developed in jungle warfare found limited application in post-war army structure. The institutional knowledge dissipated until the 1950s, when the need for such capabilities became apparent again. The jungle warfare tactics developed in New Guinea weren't glamorous. No decisive battles turned on patrol actions. No single ambush changed the war's course. The impact was cumulative. Hundreds of patrols that gathered intelligence, preventing Allied forces from walking into ambushes. Dozens of ambushes that disrupted Japanese supply lines and forced diversion of combat troops to security duties. Thousands of kilometers patrolled that denied enemy freedom of movement. The men who conducted long-range patrols in New Guinea faced environment as hostile as the enemy. Malaria-bearing mosquitoes, dengue fever, scrub typhus, dysentery, tropical ulcers, rain that fell daily for months, heat that left men dehydrated despite drinking constantly, terrain that made every kilometer feel like 5. They adapted because the mission required adaptation. They succeeded because failure meant death. The patrol tactics they developed reflected that reality. Small teams because large units couldn't move quietly. Light equipment because resupply was impossible. Strict discipline because one mistake alerted the enemy. Detailed planning because improvisation in hostile territory got people killed. The method seemed obvious in retrospect. Learning them cost lives. By 1945, Allied forces in the Pacific possessed jungle warfare capabilities unmatched anywhere. Australian divisions moved through terrain that would have stopped them in 1942. American units conducted operations that seemed impossible 3 years earlier. The transformation came through blood lessons and institutional adaptation. Units that lost men to ambushes learned ambush tactics. Patrols that got lost in featureless jungle learned navigation. Forces that collapsed from disease learned prevention. The long-range patrol tactics were one component of larger adaptation. Artillery learned to pre-register defensive fires around patrol routes. Air forces developed supply drop techniques that minimized exposure. Medical services established forward aid stations at the limit of practicality. Logistics planners calculated requirements based on actual jungle consumption rates, not peacetime estimates. Every element adapted or failed. For the men who walked point on jungle patrols, the lessons were simpler. Trust your training. Trust your team. Stay alert. Every step might be your last. Every sound might be enemy. Every mission might not come back. They did it anyway because soldiers ordered to patrol don't refuse. They adapted because humans adapt to necessity. They succeeded often enough to validate the tactics. The historical record shows what small unit patrol operations accomplished. Strategic intelligence that shaped campaign planning. Tactical intelligence that prevented Allied forces from ambush. Psychological pressure that forced Japanese to divert combat power to rear area security. Liberation of prisoners who would have died in captivity. The cumulative effect was significant though difficult to quantify. Numbers tell part of the story. The Alamo Scouts 106 to 110 missions without a man lost. The Australian 24th Battalion's 412 patrols covering 2,204 kilometers in 3 months. The 2/3 Independent Company's 969 Japanese casualties against 65 killed and 119 wounded. The statistics demonstrate effectiveness within the brutal calculus of combat. Personal accounts tell another story. Scout Gilbert Cox writing in his diary about enjoying life while waiting for the next job. Australian soldiers describing the nerve-wracking job of lead scout. Alamo Scout Galen Kittleson volunteering without knowing what Alamo Scouts were because the more he learned the better off he'd be. The human dimension mattered as much as tactical results. The legacy of long-range patrol tactics in New Guinea extended beyond immediate campaign effects. The doctrine, training methods, and operational techniques influenced post-war special operations development. The Alamo Scout Training Center's use of peer evaluation became standard in Special Forces qualification course. The Australian experience informed SASR formation and training. The lessons learned in jungle warfare shaped counterinsurgency doctrine in subsequent conflicts. Modern armies studying jungle warfare still reference New Guinea campaign operations. The terrain hasn't changed. The tactical problems remain similar. Small unit operations in restricted visibility over difficult terrain with limited resupply against adaptive enemies. The solutions developed 75 years ago provide templates because the fundamental challenges persist. The men who developed those solutions did so through necessity, not theory. They were conventional infantry thrust into unconventional warfare. They adapted their training to circumstances that training hadn't anticipated. They survived through skill, courage, and fortune. Many didn't survive. The ones who did carried knowledge purchased with their friends' lives. That knowledge became doctrine. Patrol formations that balanced security and mobility. Ambush tactics that maximized surprise and enabled withdrawal. Navigation techniques that worked when compasses failed and maps lied. Supply methods that sustained operations at the end of logistic possibility. Medical procedures that prevented disease from destroying fighting strength. The lessons were written in casualties before they were written in field manuals. The long-range patrol tactics developed in New Guinea weren't revolutionary. They were evolutionary. Small changes accumulated into comprehensive adaptation. Units that learned from each patrol improved incrementally. Commanders who analyzed after-action reports identified patterns. Training centers incorporated combat lessons into courses. The institutional learning process worked because the alternative was death. Small unit reconnaissance and ambush operations in New Guinea created the foundation for modern special operations. 6-man teams operating deep behind enemy lines. Gathering intelligence. Avoiding contact. Getting home alive. The Alamo Scouts and Australian Commando squadrons proved small teams with exceptional training could accomplish missions impossible for conventional forces. They operated in some of the most hostile terrain soldiers ever fought across. They faced a determined enemy experienced in jungle warfare. They dealt with disease that killed more men than bullets. They succeeded through adaptation, training, and courage. The record speaks for itself. Hundreds of successful patrols. Intelligence that saved thousands of lives. Tactics that became doctrine. A legacy that influences special operations to this day. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. If you want to hear more forgotten chapters of history, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Drop a comment telling us which WW2 story you want to hear next.